We're in more than a battle for funding. We're in a battle for kind of fundamental norms that underpin the work we do.
Is effective campaigning harder or easier now?
Britain is a relatively poorer and more fragmented society than it was at the time of the Jubilee campaign or Make Poverty History.
I view that period of sort of like, a golden World Cup football winning team.
If we look at history, we know that most of the really important changes in the world, most of the progressive social movements have started with campaigns.
Can you talk to me about the Heineken Effect and how faith-based organisations can have advantages in reaching places that other sort of secular NGOs wouldn't be able to?
Kind of impunity with which civilians are being killed and starved in Gaza. Parts for F-35 jets are still being exported from Britain.
My experience within the sector is that we're really good at talking about this and really terrible at doing it.
It's kind of feeding into a politics around the Western world that is all about building walls rather than bridges.
And what were the sort of hard lessons that you've had to pick up by making mistakes, I guess?
The world is a better, more stable place if we treat each other with dignity.
Patrick, thank you so much for doing an episode of Causes. All right, so let's dive in. So you studied theology at Cambridge and development studies at LSE, and now you've sort of had a varied career in international development. And so it feels to me from my research that you're made for the job you're in. What was it about your upbringing that got you so engaged in theology and development early on?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm one of 6 children, so I grew up in a big family, and we all went on to do very different things. So I don't know that the line of work I've gone into was necessarily kind of heavily preordained by my parents. But I think I grew up in a home that was fairly outward-looking, interested in what was happening in the world. Grew up in a practicing Christian home, so that was a part of the kind of fabric of daily life. And I think my mother actually worked in the charity sector as a charity fundraiser, NSPCC, Scope, and other organisations. So that was probably an influence too. But I guess fundamentally, I was probably brought up in an environment where it was understood that what was happening out there in the world mattered, and that every person had a responsibility to help try and make the world a better place than they'd found it.
Yeah. So for people who, Christian Aid is a very well-known organisation, but for people who sort of don't know what it's about other than the name, talk to me about what Christian Aid is and what it's here to do.
Sure. So Christian Aid was founded in 1945 in response to the refugee crisis in Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. The churches in Europe had asked the British and Irish churches to help support their response. And over time, that evolved to become Christian Aid. And although many things have changed in the organisation, some fundamental elements have remained the same. So, the first is that Christian Aid is a partnership organisation. We've always worked in collaboration with others rather than being a kind of directly operational, boots on the ground kind of organisation. We've always worked on the root causes of poverty as well as responding to poverty and its symptoms. So 2/3 of our income last year or thereabouts came from people in the pews in churches. That gives us a lot of stability in terms of our income, but it also gives us a lot of strategic freedom that organisations which are more reliant on institutional funding from official donors don't have. So that's a bit about who Christian Aid is. We currently work in 27 countries around the world, in Africa, Asia and the Middle East, and Latin America. on 4 program themes. So we work on supporting communities to adapt to the climate crisis, on gender justice, on building peace in communities, and on governance and rights.
Can you talk to me about how sort of your own faith feeds into your leadership thinking in this context?
Well, I'd hope that as an organisation, we have a culture of servant leadership. We don't always get everything right, but we do have organisational values of equality, dignity, justice, and love. And love is a fairly unusual organisational value. Not many development humanitarian organisations have that. And I suppose what that really means is that we, as an organisation, how we work with others, and hopefully how we work internally, is that we put ourselves in the shoes of the other person. We take seriously the dignity of each person with whom we work, and we reflect that in how we collaborate, work with each other, listen, and respect other views, even if we don't always agree.
Can you talk to me about the Heineken Effect and how faith-based organisations can have advantages in reaching places that other sort of secular NGOs wouldn't be able to?
Sure, and I think we need to be. I think we do need to be kind of self-critical and humble about the challenges of faith-based organizations in the development sector, as well as the strengths, because there are sometimes challenges with local faith actors who, while they might have very strong connections to their own religious community, can sometimes struggle to engage in the right way with people who don't share their religion. There are challenges in some religious institutions and communities with patriarchal attitudes towards women and girls. Sometimes, there are challenges with there've been challenges in religious institutions with safeguarding issues, and perhaps a culture in some religious institutions of turning a blind eye to that. So there are real challenges, but I think on a good day, faith-based networks do have extraordinary reach in many parts of the world where we're working, and they have the ability to engage people on the underlying causes of poverty and marginalization. So I think of some of the conversations we've had with Christian and Muslim organizations in Africa as part of the side-by-side movement on gender-based violence, and the way in which we've been able to use scripture within both the Christian and Muslim traditions to help open up conversations at the community level about why violence against women and girls runs counter to those religious traditions. I think that's much easier to do if you have a baseline level of faith literacy yourself. And I think often I've found that us being Christian Aid does give us legitimacy and a level of trust with communities, which takes you potentially further than if you are a secular organization. And interestingly, I've seen that being the case in non-Christian settings as well as in Christian settings. I mean, actually, on the whole, I think us having a faith identity means that people in many community settings, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, other settings, at least understand where we come from and what our motivation is. And I think what's really important in the work that we do is that we're clear that Christian Aid works with and for people of all faiths and beliefs, and we do that not as a kind of reluctant concession to universal humanitarian principles. We do that because we're a Christian organization. Actually, that kind of unconditional love of neighbor, which really lies at the root of Christian Aid's establishment, is what drives our desire to work with people of all faiths and beliefs, people of all backgrounds, irrespective of irrespective of ethnicity or gender or sexuality or any other kind of marker of people's identity.
I just want to talk about the sort of current context. In your op-ed in February in The Independent, you warned that Keir Starmer's decision to cut aid represents a race to the bottom. So you wrote, and I loved this language, by the way, I thought it was really good. Donald Trump's race to the bottom on international development has an energetic new entrant in the form of Keir Starmer. Several months on from that, do you view anything differently that you didn't anticipate when you wrote that?
I don't think I do particularly. I mean, I think actually some of the decisions that have been taken subsequently by other donors, the Dutch, the Swedes, number of other European donors, I think have kind of reinforced that accelerating trend towards kind of rowing back from commitments on international aid. I was in Nigeria in April and talking to people there who were involved in the humanitarian response in Maiduguri, and saying about not just the thousands of jobs that have gone for aid workers, but in really practical terms, the impact that's been had on the provision of aid to internally displaced people who've been, forced from their homes by the fighting between the Nigerian army and Boko Haram. So there are, real world impacts that are being felt, and we've got to kind of keep kind of sight of that. But yeah, I think we are kind of moving into a fundamentally different period. In some ways, I think some of those shifts were inevitable, and some were necessary. But the way in which it's been done, I think the very kind of cynical way in which it's been done, is really worrying, because I think it's kind of feeding into a politics around the Western world that is all about, building walls rather than bridges, and a kind of might is right ethos as well that we're seeing coming from various quarters, and that's playing out right now in Gaza, but it's playing out in other parts of the world as well. And I do think that a lot of the kind of hard-won principles that underpin our sector are being fundamentally undermined. And so, yeah, I think we've got we're in more than a battle for funding. We're in a battle for kind of fundamental norms that underpin the work we do, and we need to be thinking about how we build a constituency of support to renew support for the idea that the world is a better, more stable place if we treat each other with dignity, if we pursue basic equality, and if we uphold certain basic principles for how people are treated, particularly in situations of conflict, how people are treated when they cross national borders. And if we lose that, we, I think, are moving into very dangerous terrain.
If somehow you had the ability to have a blank piece of paper and sort of using the context that we're in now, sort of redesigning the aid system, what are you putting on that piece of paper?
Well, I think it's always been the case that aid is a relatively small but important part of how we tackle poverty and how we tackle global challenges. So I think the first thing is not to kind of pin too much on the aid system. I think it's always been the case that, policy around climate change, around trade and investment, around migration, has and around peace and security, probably has a much bigger bearing ultimately on what happens to poverty around the world than does overseas aid. But aid does have, I think, an important role in at least a couple of areas. I mean, one is obviously in humanitarian crises, where people need immediate support. But I think it also has a really important role in helping to support strong civil society and a kind of culture of active citizenship. And and you know, I think active citizens can hold states to account and make them more effective, but they can also limit the excesses of the market. So I think an active citizenship and strong civil society is a crucial counterbalance to and complement to the role of the state and the role of the market. And then, of course, there is the kind of question of kind of global kind of public goods. So whether that's a kind of public good like vaccination, and we saw during the COVID pandemic how individual countries kind of pursue beggar thy neighbor policies when it came to vaccine procurement and development, or it's issues like climate change mitigation. The only way that we can make effective progress is by governments working together around the world, and I think you need resources to support those public goods, and the aid sector has a really important role to play there. So I think there's yeah, I think that kind of focus on public goods, support for civil society, humanitarian response really needs to sit at the heart of a reformed aid system. But I also think we need, as INGOs like Christian Aid, to be clear about what our relationship is to that official aid system. I mean, of course, we're called Christian Aid, but when we were established, what was meant by aid was something very different from what the aid system has become. And I think voluntary aid given by members of the public in a country like Britain is doing something different. And I think the motivations behind it are different from the official aid given by governments. So I think understanding that distinction, and sometimes those two kinds of aid are in tension, is important.
You talked about holding states to account, and I want to talk a little bit about your sort of the make poverty history era and Jubilee 2000 and things. I sort of view that period. I wasn't working in it, but I view that period of sort of like, a golden World Cup football winning team, where a bunch of people who I've since sort of worked with have been a real core of that, and are leading organisations now, having sort of been campaigners within other organisations in the past. My question on that is, well, there's a couple, but the first one is effective campaigning harder or easier now?
I think it's probably on the whole harder. I think for two main reasons. I mean, I think, one is that Britain, if we're talking about campaigning in Britain, I think Britain is a relatively poorer and more fragmented society than it was at the time of the Jubilee campaign or Make Poverty History. So that was a period when people were, on the whole, kind of getting better off year on year. Governments' coffers were relatively full, and of course, Britain economically carried more weight in the world than it does today. So it was a very different environment in which to challenge government to take ambitious decisions on international issues. And I think we're in a world now where, in real terms, most people are no better off. In some cases, they're worse off than the time of the financial crisis in 2008. I think, the advent of social media, income inequality, I think have driven kind of polarization and fragmentation. I think in that sense, the campaigning landscape is more challenging, and I think I think also it's much harder now to create a kind of dominant issue in the media. I mean, to some extent, it has happened in the last couple of years on Gaza, of course, but I think on the whole, uh, the news cycle, the ways in which people consume news media, um, um, the kind of proliferation of different kind of channels of communication, I think makes it harder to kind of get that kind of single kind of clear campaigning message out there. I think on the whole it is more difficult, but it doesn't make campaigning any less necessary or important. And I think if we look at history, we know that most of the really important changes in the world, most of the progressive social movements have started with campaigns. And of course, many of those campaigns, when they were started, were dismissed as unrealistic, as too idealistic. Every orthodoxy that we live with today started as a heresy. We need to, I think, with campaigning, stay the course, recognize that a lot of campaigning success is down to sheer persistence in pushing an agenda. And often the return on a campaign takes place over decades. It could be hard to predict when and how a campaign will achieve a breakthrough. And you look at, for example, at the landmines treaty ban, and of course that's coming under challenge again now in places like Ukraine. But there was campaigning for many years on a landmines treaty ban. And then it was only in the 1990s that a real breakthrough was achieved. And similarly on the debt crisis, the Jubilee debt campaign came off the back of about 15 years of debt advocacy. I mean, the debt crisis started in the 1970s. The Jubilee debt campaign success came in the 20 years later in the late 90s.
How do you how do we all, I guess, stay the course if what are the sort of green flags you look out for that give you confidence that something is working and the traction is happening, even though it might take 20 years for it to play out?
Yeah, well, I think good campaigns have intermediate milestones short of the ultimate campaign goal being achieved, and I do think indicators like who out there in the public square is supporting your campaigning calls are really important. What are some of the kind of intermediate kind of political or policy changes that show that you're on the right track? And I think actually we've seen with I think we've seen this with some of the advocacy campaigning around Gaza. I mean, there's huge frustration amongst many people at the kind of impunity with which civilians are being killed and starved in Gaza. But there has, at the same time, been a shift in how the British government and other Western governments are now approaching this issue. They've not gone nearly far enough or fast enough. But, for example, the question of arms exports to Israel is now on the table in a way that it wasn't a year ago. And while parts for F-35 jets are still being exported from Britain, there has been some shift by the government on arms exports. So, I mean, that falls well short of where we want the government to be in terms of its stance on what's happening in Gaza. But nonetheless, it indicates that there is some campaigning impact, there is some movement. So we shouldn't underestimate the importance, I think, of public pressure, of people mobilizing.
How did you find the transition from sort of advocacy campaigning to leading a a whole organization having to think about all the other areas of an organization. What were the sort of hard lessons that you've had to pick up by making mistakes, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it is a big transition. I mean, obviously, having been on the senior leadership team at Save the Children International for 8 years, you're spending a lot of time around the table with colleagues who are leading in other areas, with finance directors and fundraising directors and people directors and others. So to some extent, I think that senior leadership team experience gains you some exposure to how the organization as a whole works. But once you're in the chief executive position, it is different, and you've got unique responsibility to lead the organization as a whole. So you do need to kind of take off the kind of functional hat that you wore kind of earlier in your career, and manage the organizational business in a kind of 360 degrees way. And a lot of that is about having people around you in your team who you're confident can lead in their respective areas, and people who know what you don't know. So, I don't have a background in fundraising. I don't have a background in finance and corporate governance. So having the right people in those roles in your team who you can give direction to, give support to, but at the same time can depend on to effectively lead that function day to day, I think is really crucial. So yes, I mean, I think in making that transition, you're using different muscles, perhaps from the ones that you've used earlier in your career, and learning from peers, I think, is often very helpful. I think your relationship with your colleagues changes a bit when you are in the CEO role, and sometimes you need people outside of your organization to be able to have kind of certain conversations with, use as a sounding board. One of the advantages, perhaps, of having worked in the sector for a long time is that I do have quite a wide network of people who I know, who I've worked with down the years, and who I can kind of informally use as a sounding board, as a bit of a support network. So,
how often are you sort of running live challenges past people? So how often are you sort of leaning on others in a similar role in another organisation to be like
reasonably often? And yeah, I mean, there are a few kind of groups that I'm a part of, I suppose. Obviously, there's the Disasters Emergency Committee board, which brings together the CEOs of 15 UK international NGOs. So that's quite an important network. I get together with particularly counterparts from the CAFOD, Islamic Relief, other faith-based NGOs on a fairly regular basis.
To sort of put a wrapper around a single question on leadership that I'm asking everybody, what is good leadership to you? What are the sort of bullet points of good leadership, and what kind of leader are you aspiring to be?
Well, I think good leadership is about providing strategic direction, and about being the kind of, if you like, the storyteller in chief for the organization that you're leading. But I think to do those things, you need to listen. You need to know what you don't know. You need to be curious and be setting out to learn new things and improve. And that requires, that you hold yourself accountable. You're held accountable by your board, but also you're holding people working to you accountable as well. So I think that is, I think that those are probably the kind of fundamentals of good leadership. In any organization of any real size, you have to recognize that the vast majority of decisions being taken on a day-to-day basis are not being taken by you and shouldn't be taken by you. So the number of decisions that I take by myself in isolation should be very small, very limited. I mean, most decisions need to be taken um, much closer to the kind of point of impact than I am, and by people who've much more of the day-to-day detail of the work. But it's my job to ensure that the organisation provides a strategic framework within which the right decisions are taken at the right time, and people are kind of held accountable for that. So perhaps the opposite of kind of good leadership is when you become a bottleneck. You fail to delegate. You pull too much up into your kind of area of responsibility.
You've spoken about doing fewer things better, I think I read. And I think generally my experience as within the sector is that we're really good at talking about this and really terrible at doing it.
Yeah, I think
I often feel like we talk a lot about being sort of laser focused and we just aren't. Even if we have that internal conversations around prioritizing and stuff. How can leaders actually embed doing less better within the culture of an organization?
Yeah. No, it's definitely difficult. I mean, it's there are all sorts of reasons why it's difficult because staff have their own particular specialisms and skills and interests. So that can kind of sometimes crowd out organizational priorities or kind of weaken organizational priorities, dilute them. Funders come in with different priorities, and then you make a series of pragmatic decisions about whether or not to accept funding, which again risks diluting your strategic focus. And then I think often organizations have strategies that don't really articulate very clear choices. So I think, first and foremost, you need a strategy that makes choices, and you need to be clear about what you're not going to do as a result, and you need to feed that through into which funding you pursue, particularly institutional funding from donor governments and UN agencies and trusts and foundations, and you need to be really clear about the deliverables in individual staff members' roles and how that ladders up to the corporate priorities. So that's all much easier said than done. But I think in a way, what can help model that prioritization is to very visibly stop doing certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And it can seem counterintuitive, I think, sometimes to kind of at the same time take kind of areas of work off the table and set a tone of being ambitious about kind of impact. But actually, I think they do go hand in hand, and we've too often in the sector conflated financial size with impact. I think often the most impactful organizations are relatively smaller organizations that really understand their added value and focus on what they're good at.
All right, we've just got 3 sort of quick questions, and then we'll wrap. What's one myth about faith charities you wish you could dispel?
I think one of the myths I would like to kind of puncture is that we kind of secretly either have a preference for working with our co-religionists, or that we're secretly trying to convert people, proselytize through the work that we do. Now, I would hope that after 80 years of ActionAid's work, we've established a track record that shows that we are there for people irrespective of their background, their identity. But the question still gets asked all the time.
Yeah. What's a piece of advice someone's given you that turned out to be terrible advice?
Very good question. I don't know. I don't know that I've I don't know that I've kind of received terrible advice and followed it on the whole. I mean, I think
It's a good sign of leadership.
The advice I've listened to has generally been quite sound advice, even if at the time I received it, I was a little bit resistant. And perhaps learning who to listen to is something maybe you get better at, and I think is an important skill in itself. I had a colleague who told me that her grandmother used to say to her, "You have to hear the sense in the nonsense." So, there's a lot of noise when you're in a leadership role. A lot of people telling you how things could be done differently or better. And it's, you need to avoid either kind of constantly kind of shifting in response to the last conversation you had, but also you have to at the same time learn to discern in all of that noise what actually needs to be taken on board.
Thanks, Patrick, for doing this episode.
Thanks,
Thank
Nate.
you.
Thanks
Cheers.
a lot. Take care.